it's Dr. Nerida. Welcome back to another episode of the Happy Horse Nutrition Podcast. In this episode, we are going to be talking about one of my least favourite topics, and that is feeding in drought. Drought is tough, and as a kid growing up on a farm, I got to experience it many times firsthand, and man, there's such distinct memories of feeding animals in drought. In fact, one of my very earliest memories was out in the back of an old Land Rover, which was the majority of our farm vehicles in those days, feeding sheep, so just dribbling wheat out the back of the Land Rover. I think the reason why I remember it so well is my foot fell down between the back of the Land Rover and the tailgate, and I hurt myself. I remember crying. But yeah, it's a distinct memory. And then when I was sort of in late high school years, so 16 through 18, we had some really severe droughts. And I remember at one point just thinking, I just can't imagine grass ever being able to grow here again. The ground was just so bare and had been for so long that I'd actually forgotten how grass grew, and I couldn't see how it was ever going to grow again. It just seemed like everything was so devastated by the drought that it was never going to come back. But of course it does rain eventually, and it came back. And the same thing has happened many, many times over since those years in the late 90s. So it's something as Aussies, and for the rest of us around the other parts of the world as well, but I guess I'm focused on thinking about Australian droughts at the moment. It's a part of life for us, as it is for so many people around the world. But I think what sort of brought this into focus for me just recently is we flew into Melbourne 2 weeks ago for an animal nutrition conference, and flying out of Tamworth, where I live, and into Melbourne in Victoria, and seeing the state of the drought down there was really shocking. You get that feeling when you see drought, and I guess it's the feeling that a lot of us carry around when we live through drought. But yeah, I was really quite taken aback at how severe the drought was. I knew it was drought, I just hadn't seen it. So seeing it has really inspired me to want to provide as much information as I can to you about feeding horses in drought, because it's sometimes not easy and it can be very stressful, and I think it's emotionally tough to feed animals during drought. You see them standing around with nothing to go and graze, and always seeming hungry and always looking to you for food. So I find that tough, and I know a lot of you will find that tough as well. So we'll cover part one of the Drought Feeding Happy Horse Nutrition series today, and then I'll do a part two. So today I want to talk about predominantly forage and getting enough forage into your horses during a drought, because every horse's diet should be based on forage. And unfortunately for us during a drought, through their 55 million year evolution, they have evolved to very much need a diet that is based on forage. So when we feed during drought, our biggest consideration is how do we still get enough forage into our horses to keep their gut healthy and getting enough nutrient into them, and in keeping their gut healthy and providing enough nutrition, keeping them physically and mentally healthy. I find I need to think about feeding horses during drought in terms of both keeping them physically healthy, so making sure they maintain enough weight and have all of the nutrients they need to operate their immune system, and that their muscles and grow their hooves and maintain a proper hair coat, all of those things that they need to do normally. How do we do that? How do we provide them the nutrition they need to do all of those things during a drought? But also, how do we feed them in a way that keeps them mentally healthy? I think is almost as equally important as keeping them physically healthy during a drought. So, of course, the biggest challenge during drought is that it won't rain and pasture disappears, and hay that is normally relatively easy to buy, or sometimes very, very easy to buy, becomes quite difficult to source. So if your horse is normally a horse that is grazing out on pasture, the first thing that will happen is that your pastures will generally brown off because they're not being watered by rain anymore. And then as the horses keep grazing the pasture when no further pasture is growing due to lack of rain, then the pasture will eventually just disappear and they won't have any pasture to graze. So we need to replace the forage that they would have otherwise been getting from their pasture as hay If your horse is normally fed hay, so if you're in an adjustment situation, for example, where you normally feed hay, your problem is slightly different. So where it is normally quite easy to buy good quality hay, it will become much more difficult to find good quality hay. It will become much more expensive to buy good quality hay. And sometimes you end up in a situation where you simply can't find the quality of hay that you would like, and you'll essentially be forced to use a much lower quality of hay than what you would normally use. So we'll talk about how to deal with both of those situations. So with pasture disappearing, ideally the best situation is to be buying good quality hay, and hopefully if you have some storage area and you're able to, you'll have some good quality hay saved up for the days that won't rain. So as their pasture starts to disappear and they're not getting as much forage from their pasture, it's a matter of bringing in enough hay to replace the forage that they would have otherwise been receiving from the pasture, and the rest of their diet. So if you're feeding other feeds or supplements to balance their diet, which we'll talk about more a little bit later on, it's essentially a matter of just bringing in good quality hay that will replace the pasture, and the rest of the diet can essentially stay the same. That's if you can find good quality hay. One little tip here is that if you do find yourself in a drought situation and you do actually have a decent amount of dry pasture, it's actually a really good idea to restrict your horse's access to that pasture and just allow them to strip graze it, because it will mean that you are able to make that pasture last a lot longer. So where if you just give them free access to the pasture, they may eat it out in 1 to 2 months, depending on how big your pasture is. It may be a lot faster, it may be a lot slower. But if you can strip graze them and restrict their access to the pasture, it just means that you're able to make that fibre resource, that forage resource, last a little bit longer. I was fortunate enough in the drought that ended in the very early 2020s for us here in Tamworth. I had a large paddock that had quite a lot of dry, it was predominantly Queensland bluegrass pasture, and I was able to strip graze it off, and I made that. It must have been maybe 10 acres. I made that pasture last it was nearly 12 months. And it was just so, I think for me, the biggest part of having that pasture available was I would move the fence for my horses every morning and give them a new strip of pasture to graze. And it just meant that they were still grazing. It was not so much that it was providing better nutrition. And in fact, the nutrition would have been worse than the hay that I was also providing them. But it meant that they got that mental stimulation of grazing. So instead of letting them eat that whole pasture out reasonably quickly in, say, 2 to 3 months, I was able to make it last a lot longer, and then they still had that ability to graze every day, even if it was only for a couple of hours. So it is something to consider if you do still have some standing pasture, just to use strip grazing to make that pasture resource last a lot longer. So just to recap that little section, if you can find good quality hay, as your pasture resources disappear, then bringing in the good quality hay will essentially replace your pasture in the diet, and for a large part you'll be able to keep the rest of your horse's diet the same. It starts to get a little bit tricky when you can't find good quality hay and you have to start opting for poorer quality hay, because as we bring poorer quality hay, so let's say, for example, you had a mixed meadow or grass pasture that you had been able to find early in a drought that had good levels of protein and a high enough level of energy to maintain your horse's body weight when fed as a majority of their diet with whatever feeds and supplements you were using. But then you were unable to source that hay again and had to opt for a much stalkier, much stemmier, lower energy, lower protein hay. You'll find that as you substitute that into your horse's diet, your horse will probably start to lose weight and may start to lose muscle, because the nutrition coming from those poorer quality hays is not going to be nearly as good as the nutrition you were getting from your good quality hay. So you might be thinking, well, how am I going to know if my hay is good quality or poor quality? But you can actually trust your senses on that one. So there was some really cool research that was done in France a few years ago now, but they found a group of people, and from memory, I don't think they were necessarily even horse people, but they gave them a lot of different hays, and they asked them to classify the hay based on the smell and the feel and the colour. And based on those senses, they were able to actually group the hays into groups of hay that aligned with the nutrient content. So the hays that were greener and softer and smelt better had the higher energy and protein levels compared to the hays that were described as being, tough and stalky and brown and had a smell that wasn't nearly as appealing. Not necessarily mouldy, and in fact, if you can smell mould in a hay, you need to avoid that hay, but they just don't have the delicious smell. I think it's a delicious smell of a hay. When you stick your nose into prime lucerne hay or freshly cut grass hay, it smells, maybe if you're a horse nutritionist, but I think this is something common to horse people in general. It smells good enough to eat. I love the smell of really good quality hay. So those hays that smell really good compared to the hays that don't smell so good, humans are able to use our senses to determine the nutrient quality of hay. You will know as you're buying different hays whether you're going up in quality or down in quality. And as you come down in quality, as hay gets harder and harder to find during drought, it means that you will have to adjust your horse's diet more to top up the nutrients that it's no longer getting out of the hay. So if you are forced to use a lower quality hay, you'll find that you probably need to use more hard feeds or higher protein hard feeds to actually balance your horse's diet up, so that they can maintain their weight and maintain their muscle, and also make sure that you're supplying all the vitamins and minerals they need to stay healthy in general. It's not super easy to balance a horse's diet without using some sort of tool. So this is why back in the early 2000s we built Feed Excel as a nutrition calculator, and why we now also have the My Happy Horse Nutrition app. So as the hay quality changes during a drought for you, you're actually able to adjust your horse's diet based on the quality of hay that you have. You can also just follow feeding rates for the feeds and supplements that you are using. So if you have a feed that says, for your horse's body weight and workload, it should be fed at 3 kilograms per day, then feeding that feed at 3 kilograms per day should actually make sure that you are meeting all of your horse's vitamin and mineral requirements. And then if your horse is not maintaining weight at that feeding rate, you may need to change to a feed that has got a higher feeding rate. So making sure during a drought that you're actually feeding feeds according to their feeding rate will also give you a really good shot at making sure your horse's diet is balanced. But if you want to look at your horse's diet in finer detail and really make sure that you are actually meeting all of their requirements, then I would really suggest using My Happy Horse as a nutrition app to make sure that your horse's diet is balanced. When buying hay, you do have to make sure that it's always clean, not mouldy, not dusty. It's as much as we talk about, being forced to use poor quality hay, I mean poor quality from a nutrition perspective, so low energy, low protein, not poor quality from a hygiene perspective. So you don't ever want to feed hay that is excessively dusty, and you definitely don't want to feed hay that is mouldy to horses, because it will cause health issues, and mould is a big issue. So what you'll have often alongside mould is mycotoxins, which can then cause liver damage and all sorts of other things that you want to avoid for your horse during drought. I do find something that's very useful is to have a hay budget in mind. So when I say hay budget, not how much you're going to spend on hay, because that's always a little bit hard to plan in a drought, but knowing how much hay you actually need to get your horse through a certain amount of time in a drought, so that you can make sure that you have enough hay on hand. And of course, we never know when a drought is going to break. The sooner the better for every drought, but knowing how much hay you need will help you know how much hay you should buy. So if we talk about an average size 500 kilograms, so that's average size thoroughbred, or even an average size quarter horse. I've got a quarter horse here and quite a solid paint that are both just over 15 hands, and they're just over 500 kilos, so around 520 kilos each. So for horses around that size, if we were to feed them 2 to 3% of their body weight in hay per day during a drought, which is the ideal amount you want to be aiming for, that's 10 to 15 kilograms of hay per day. And that amount works out at between 70 and 105 kilograms of hay per week, which if we take that back to small square bales, that will be around 25 kilograms when they're made well, that's 3 to 4.5 bales of hay per week, or 12 to 18 bales per month. So if you're buying hay For a horse, then you need to have at least that much on hand when the horse is around 500 kilograms. Obviously, if they're bigger horses, then that number is going to increase, and smaller horses, it will reduce a little bit. And if you've got multiple horses, obviously you need to multiply that out by the number of horses that you've got. But it's 12 to 18 bales per month for a 500 kilogram horse. When buying hay, it is sometimes the case that you will not be able to find the hay that you normally buy, and you'll start to see hays, depending on how extensive the drought and how widespread the drought is, you'll start to see hays that are unfamiliar. And during a drought, I get a lot of questions about which hays are safe and which are unsafe, which ones should we avoid. So on your safe list, you can add haylages and silages. I shouldn't say which hays are safe, which forages. So if you can't find hay, then you can use some alternate, either hays or alternate forages. So well-made haylage or silage are okay. They can be used. They do have to be really well made, and they must not be mouldy. And there is a risk of botulism in haylage and silage, but in saying that, they're very, very common forages for horses around the world, and they are definitely an option for you if you can't find hay during a drought. You can safely use pea hay or pea straw. You can use cereal crop straw, so wheat, oats and barley straw. So the straw being the stalk that is left over after the cereal crop has been harvested. It is really important that you avoid failed crop. So failed crop is going to have still a lot of seed heads, potentially with quite a lot of grain. And if you get failed wheat or barley crop hay, that does have the potential to cause laminitis in insulin dysregulated or metabolic horses and ponies. And if there's enough grain and the horses selectively eat enough of it, it may also cause hindgut acidosis, because wheat and barley are very poorly digested in the small intestine. And so most of that grain, what grain there is, will travel through into the hindgut and will ferment and cause a buildup of acids there, which is something you want to avoid. So the straw from all of those cereals is safe, provided it's clean and mold-free. But failed crop I would avoid. Canola hay is an unusual one, but is possible to use. Sugarcane hay can be used, but I would avoid it for horses that have PPID or Cushing's disease, and also for any horses that are prone to laminitis, you should avoid sugarcane hay. And vetch hay is something that you may also see too, and it can be used, but it's an interesting one where you don't want to feed too much of it. So don't feed any more than 0.5 kilogram per 100 kilograms of your horse's body weight. So 2.5 kilograms per day for a 500 kilogram horse, because any more than that can cause, not always, but can cause some weird issues. So weird swellings. So you can use it, and this is in a drought when you can't find other hays that are suitable. If vetch hay is something that you have access to and you don't have a lot of access to anything else, you can use some, but you do just need to be careful how much you use. There are some hays that you should avoid. So you should avoid lupin hay, because it may cause a condition called lupinosis. You are best to avoid sorghum and forage sorghum hay, as it can be high in prussic acids or hydrocyanic acid. Sometimes you can find hay, so from people like Feed Central, who have lots and lots of hays on their website that come with a full analysis. You can find hays that do have a test for prussic acid, so you will be able to determine whether it is actually safe from a prussic acid perspective, and then it may be okay to feed, but have a chat with the people at Feed Central if you do find you need to rely on that type of hay. It is always, you would need to buy one that has got an analysis, and then you would need to determine that it was actually safe for horses. And then the last hays that you should avoid are red clover and list clover hay, which they're really uncommon in Australia. If you're listening in other parts of the world, they may be more common for you. But those clovers have been reported to cause liver damage and also photosensitization associated with the liver damage. So you are best to avoid those ones. If you can't find enough hay, even within those more alternate hays, then you can use some alternate fibre options. And within those alternate fibre options, you've got some that are high energy, so they will be much better at helping your horse maintain body weight, and some that are much lower in energy, so the lower energy ones are very good at filling a horse up, but not necessarily very good at providing a lot of nutrition. Some of those options would be things like hay cubes and chaff, lupins or soybean hulls, sugar beet pulp and copper meal. So they're ones on the higher energy options list. And then on your lower energy options, you've got things like oat hulls or sunflower seed hulls, and also safe and palatable browse. So if you're somewhere that has access to browse, so trees and shrubs, and you can provide that to horses, then that is also a very legitimate way of providing them fibre when you don't have access to hay. I remember as a kid, we would not cut down the tree, but we would cut a lot of limbs off the she oaks that were growing along a lot of our creek and waterway banks, because the cattle would eat that, and we were so desperate for forage for them that was what we would feed them. And also the rough-barked apple trees too, the cattle used to eat when they were, I guess during a drought when they were hungry. They used to find them quite palatable as well, so we used to give those trees a trim too. So if you do have safe and palatable browse and you really are getting into the dire straits where you can't find enough forage for your horses, then that is a good way of providing them some fibre. Of course, the challenge in a drought, and the reason why it is so important to provide them so much forage, is because they have this massive gut that has been designed over many million years of evolution to constantly have forage and fibre flowing through it. So it's incredibly important to keep their gut full of forage and fibre so that we keep their gut healthy. And in the second part of this drought feeding series, I'll actually talk about ways to feed and things you can do to prevent nutrition-related diseases that become very common during drought because of the fact that they don't necessarily have forage available all of the time. So things like gastric ulcers and sand colic and just general colic become more prevalent during a drought, and your horse is definitely at higher risk of those during a drought. So in the second part of this series, I will talk more specifically about feeding to prevent those nutrition-related diseases during drought. So to wrap this episode up, I just want to talk about some other important considerations when feeding during a drought. So we have been talking about hay and the importance of always having hay available. And it really is important to always have hay available as much as you can. So you need to get a little bit creative with how you feed hay to your horses during a drought to slow them down, because if you give them their 2 to 3% body weight of hay per day, so 10 to 15 kilograms of hay, because it's hay, they're able to stand there and eat that quite quickly. And you might find that they are able to eat their entire daily hay allocation in 6 hours or less, which leaves them 18 hours of the day standing around doing nothing, which is not good for their physical health and it's not good for their mental health. So do get really creative in how you feed the hay. Put it in hay nets, put it in hay pillows or hay bags, hay boxes. You can use the hay balls, and if you've got a playful horse, I find that the hay balls are quite good because they'll push them around and play with them, and it gives them something to keep them, I guess, mentally stimulated while they're also eating. And it's a little bit more of a challenge for them too. They have to find which holes the hay is poking out of to be able to eat it. Just find ways that you can slow their hay intake down. And my other little tip is that even if you can find good quality hay, still have straw available. So I make a habit of having straw in my shed, and I find that if I ever have to have a horse confined, and certainly if I was feeding in drought, or if I am feeding in drought, I have straw available because it's not very palatable straw, as you might imagine, and horses won't just go and eat it because it tastes good. So it can be sitting there and they won't go and gorge on it and finish it really quickly, but what it gives them is a source of fibre to go back to when they just need something to chew on. So I'm quite convinced that horses know when the pH in their stomach is getting quite low, which then predisposes them to a high risk of gastric ulceration. And I think if they have something to chew on when they sense that, they're able to go and chew on some fibre, create a lot of saliva, and buffer or dilute the acid in their stomach, and also put more fibre in their stomach to stop the acid from being able to splash around and create gastric ulcers. So if you've got straw available, they'll generally leave it sitting there until they really do need something to go and chew on, and then they will go and chew on it. So use slow feeders of some description to slow them down eating their hay allocation for the day, and then also have straw. If you happen to have a horse that also loves its straw, also put it in a slow feeder. But for the most part, you can have the straw just sitting out somewhere where they can't walk all over it and, urinate on it and destroy it, but have it readily available for them so that when they need something to chew on and they're just, searching for more fibre, they're able to go and chew on the straw. It saves them doing things. I see racehorses that are in stables that don't feed a lot of hay, and they'll do things like chew on their own tongue. And I'm pretty sure that is to generate saliva. This is my guess, knowing horses and knowing their gastrointestinal physiology and a little bit about their behaviour. I do think that they will go and seek out something to chew on when they really need it, and straw is perfect. You do always need to feed a balanced diet. So you need to balance your diet up against the hay that you're feeding. And by balanced diet, I mean making sure that you're bringing in the vitamins and minerals that are missing from the hay, and also any additional protein and calories that your horse needs to maintain weight and muscle. So what you need to feed during a drought is really dependent on what your horse is doing. So are they, a broodmare with a foal at foot? Are they a horse that's in quite heavy work still? Are they horses that are at rest and not in work and not doing too much? So, horses that are at rest, you might find that a balancer pellet is going to be enough to maintain their weight if you've got decent quality hay available. If you've got a broodmare with a foal at foot, she's obviously going to have massive energy and protein requirements, and so you're going to be wanting to look at feeding her a really high quality, well-balanced, complete feed to balance her diet out. The My Happy Horse nutrition app will obviously help you do that if you need help to do that. And you can also, as I mentioned earlier, you can also find good quality feeds that do a good job for your horses, and then make sure that you follow their feeding rate correctly so that you know that your horse is getting the intended amount of vitamins and minerals in that feeding rate. On top of a balanced diet, you must also make sure that salt is always available. So the salt is unbelievably important for horses. It is an electrolyte, so it's really important for everything that requires an electrolyte in the horse's body. So things like muscle contraction. Of course, your horse's heart is a muscle, so it's really crucial for their survival. You need to make sure that they do have enough salt in their diet. And during a drought, possibly even more so, particularly if the drought is during the summer months and is very hot, because they will obviously be sweating quite a lot, and the sodium content of your hay may vary quite dramatically. So sometimes it may be quite high in sodium, and other times it is possible for sodium to be virtually non-existent in forage. So it is really, really important that you have free choice salt available. My preference is to put it out as loose rock salt or loose fine salt, whatever you can access, and in a plastic or rubber feed bin that is always available for your horses. Reason being is a horse's tongue is quite soft, so for them to lick a salt block, a compressed salt block, it hurts their tongue, and you'll find that they'll actually chew on those blocks as opposed to licking them like cattle do. So I find when you want to make sure that they can get enough salt in their diet, it is always better to put loose salt out for them as opposed to a block. If you do really want to use a block, then I find the pink Himalayan salt blocks are quite good, because they can tend to lick them down to a nice smooth surface. They're not a compressed block. So they are better and softer on their tongue, kinder on their tongue than what a compressed salt block is. And to go along with salt, you must also make sure that your horse has got a clean source of water. And this can become a little trickier in droughts, especially if your horses are usually reliant on a dam. So dam water can get quite manky during a drought. I find my own dam when it's dry, and then I have just enough rain to create just a little bit of runoff. I'll often get an algal bloom on my dam. When water quality is not good, if your horse is reliant on a dam, give them access to another water source. So put a trough or, a number of buckets that you can fill up with hoses, just so that they can avoid less than ideal water source if they choose to or if they need to. If your dam water quality is really poor and you are concerned, it's probably best that you do actually fence off the dam so that they can't get in there and drink it. We'll talk about the relationship between water quality and colic in the next episode, where we'll talk about preventing disease during drought. But for now, just remember that it is really important to provide your horses with a clean source of water during drought. And remember too, because they're reliant on hay's got almost no water in it. It'll be somewhere between 8 and 12% water, and most of that water is not available to your horse. It's really tightly bound to the fibre in the hay. So hay will actually make them seemingly a lot thirstier than what they would otherwise be if they were grazing pasture, because pasture, when it's green, or it has any amount of green in it, will have at least some water in it. Some pastures are, upwards of 90% water. So you'll see horses drinking very little when they've got access to green pasture versus drinking a lot more when their entire forage part of their diet is some sort of dried forage. So water is really, really important during a drought. And the last little nutrition-based tip I want to add in here, and something that is really important to take into consideration during drought, is to make sure that your horses are getting enough vitamin E and vitamin A. So these vitamins are not fans of being baled into hay. So by the time hay is made, you've lost quite a lot already of the vitamin E and vitamin A that was present in the plant that is being made into hay. And within about 6 months, almost 100% of both of those vitamins will have disappeared out of your horse's hay. So the hay is not a source of those vitamins at all. And most complete feeds are not formulated to take that into consideration with vitamin E, because vitamin E is an incredibly expensive nutrient. So when we formulate feeds, we tend not to put more vitamin E in than we need, because it makes it very expensive. And for the most part, horses don't need the same levels of vitamin E supplemented into their diet during normal periods of time, because they get so much vitamin E out of green pastures. So instead of making the feeds excessively expensive for you all year round, what I tend to do as a nutritionist is formulate feeds so that they've got plenty of vitamin E to meet vitamin E requirements under normal conditions. But that's not going to be enough vitamin E for your horses generally, depending on the feed, but generally won't be enough vitamin E for your horses during drought conditions. So a very easy way to increase the amount of vitamin E in your horse's diet during drought is to buy human vitamin E capsules. So you can get capsules that are 1,000 IU. I find with my own horses, if I slowly adapt them to eating the capsule, they'll generally really happily just eat the capsule, but you can also just snip them in half and squeeze the vitamin E oily stuff out of the middle into your horse's feed, and then I would throw the two ends of the capsule in there as well so that they get used to eating them. So that's a simple and really economical way of adding vitamin E. You can, of course, buy horse supplements that are high in vitamin E, and then they're also perfectly good way of adding additional vitamin E to your horse's diet as well. And then vitamin A is a really easy one. So carrots are an excellent source of beta-carotene, which your horse can then convert into vitamin A. And in fact, it is my preference during a drought to provide additional vitamin A from carrots, because horse feeds and supplements are formulated with synthetic vitamin A. Whereas the vitamin A that horses get out of pasture and hay that is less than 6 months old will be in the form of beta-carotene that horses then convert to vitamin A. But beta-carotene itself is also a nutrient. So if you use carrots to provide additional vitamin A to horses during drought, it means that they're getting both beta-carotene and beta-carotene that they convert into vitamin A so that they can also meet their vitamin A requirements. and they're so incredibly rich in vitamin A. It only takes a couple of carrots a day for your horses to get enough beta carotene to then meet their vitamin A requirement. And most horses do love carrots. So if your horse is a carrot lover, then you can give them a couple of carrots a day during drought. It's an awesome treat. They will absolutely love you for it, and you can feel good about it too, because you know that in those carrots there is incredibly useful nutrition in the form of beta carotene. The last thing I want to mention with feeding during drought is if you're feeding multiple horses, do be very conscious of their pecking order and make sure that the horses in the lower pecking order do have enough access to hay and feed. So if you have got horses that will typically be chased away from the hay, do make sure that you have multiple places that horses can come in to feed, and not just one hay feeder that a bossy horse will be able to control, or a number of bossy horses will be able to control, because the ones that are lower in the pecking order will miss out and they will start to struggle during drought. And of course, the same with any supplementary feeds that you're feeding. Just make sure that the horses lower in the pecking order do get the opportunity to eat all of the feed that they are feeding. So hopefully that helps a little with thinking about how to feed your horses during drought, and has a couple of tips in there for you to keep them healthy during drought. I will talk in the next episode about preventing disease, and I'll also cover a little bit about things you can do to keep them mentally occupied and mentally healthy, because that is a really important consideration during drought as well. Until then, go and check out your hay and have a think about how well your horse is doing on that hay, and whether you might need to have a look at actually balancing up the horse's diet. And if you haven't already looked at the levels of vitamin E and vitamin A, then vitamin E human capsules and carrots are a wonderful addition to horses' diets during drought. And hang in there. It is very ironic that today, while I'm recording this, I'm receiving flood warnings on my phone because it is so wet where we are. It's such a funny old country, and then only need to drive about 5 hours southwest and I hit quite severe drought conditions. So hang in there. I know it's tough. I know it's mentally tough, and it's emotionally tough to get horses through drought and to get yourself through drought. But the good thing is it usually rains eventually, and then you get to deal with a whole lot of other issues like feeding horses on lush green pasture. But hopefully you'll get to do that sooner than later. And do remember, if you are needing to ask some more specific questions about drought feeding, then you can go to our website, myhappy.horse, and use the Dr. Nerida AI, which is me in AI form, and she can answer all of your questions about drought feeding 24/7, and anything our AI can't answer, then we're happy to help you out as well. Catch you next time. Thank you so much for listening. If you'd like to know more about the My Happy Horse virtual equine nutritionist, you can head on over to myhappy.horse. And also, while you're there, check out the Dr. Nerida AI, which is me in AI format. And that version of me is happy to answer your questions about horse nutrition 24/7. Thanks again, and we'll catch you soon.